Hello, my name is Paloma Dallas, and I'm the Senior Program Officer for the Charles F. Kettering Foundation's Democracy Around the Globe focus area. For those who don't know us, the Charles F. Kettering Foundation is a nonpartisan nonprofit operating foundation committed to advancing inclusive democracies by fostering civic engagement, promoting government accountability, and countering authoritarianism. This panel discussion is part of a series put on by our Democracy Around the Globe team as we explore democratic threats in this critical election year for the United States and for countries around the world. The challenge of misinformation and disinformation is one that has been on a lot of our minds recently, and I'm delighted to have Dean Jackson, a researcher with more than a decade of experience at the intersection of democracy, media, and technology, as a collaborator and moderator of this session, as we explore a particular facet of disinformation, how identity-based disinformation campaigns are used to inflame existing societal divisions. And I'm thrilled to have three brilliant panelists with us who will drill down into how we are seeing these tactics being employed, the dangers they pose to democracy, and how to counter these efforts. We'll be focusing particularly on examples from the Americas. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Dean Jackson. Thank you.
Thanks, Paloma. And thank you to the Kettering Foundation for hosting this today. Over the last decade, scholars have been increasingly concerned about the role of information technology in democratic crises. The discourse around this often centers on mis and disinformation, essentially information that's untrue or deceptive. These are contested terms. Scholars disagree if they're the best way to describe the problem, but considering the lack of a readily understood and agreed upon alternative, we'll use them here today. The way this issue is often framed as one of truth versus untruth and knowledge versus ignorance has promoted an agenda focused on creating, identifying, and uplifting trustworthy information sources. But when we look at how autocrats and liberal actors actually use information, it often is as a wedge to reinforce social divides around identity issues in ways that benefit those autocrats. We've seen many examples, from anti-Rohingya operations out of the Burmese military to Russian propaganda in Europe targeting refugee, LGBT, and gender issues. For this webinar, we're focused especially on the role of disinformation as it affects the Americas, especially Spanish speakers in the United States and countries in South America. We have three great guest speakers today. Sam Bradshaw, an assistant professor in foreign policy and global security at American University in Washington, D.C. Roberta Braga, founder and executive director at the Digital Democracy Institute of the Americas. And Raquel Recuero, associate professor and researcher in the Communication and Languages Department at the Universidade Federal de Pelotas in Brazil. Sam, I wanted to start with you. How does the use of identity as a wedge issue facilitate democratic backsliding? And how does thinking about the role identity plays in this process change our understanding of global trends?
Thanks, Dean. Thanks for that question. And maybe to start to just give a little background too about me and my work. I've spent a lot of time studying, tracking, analyzing mis and disinformation campaigns around the globe. And what you said in your introduction really resonates with me, because watching these campaigns take place in real time, going through, reviewing the narratives that we see emerge, it's not so much about pushing narratives that are true versus false. There can be an element to that, to modern and contemporary disinformation campaigns, but by taking this identity lens to the issue, you can also see the way that bad actors try to weaponize the vocabulary of racism, sexism, xenophobia, and this kind of weaponization of identity, I think, introduces a whole new kind of angle or frame to think about the challenges of disinformation to democracy beyond this narrow conception of just getting truthful or accurate information to then go out and vote in an election. And so when I'm thinking about the ways that identity and identity-based disinformation impact democracy and democratic backsliding broadly, of course, there is an aspect to elections and to who might participate in elections, especially if certain kinds of groups of individuals are being targeted with identity-based disinformation in order to suppress them from participating politically. But we can also think about broader institutions of democracy that might be affected by these kinds of campaigns. Here, I'm thinking about, polarization and the way that we saw Russian campaigns in the 2016 US presidential election go after racial narratives to make it hard to bring communities together, and instead, pointed and drove a lot of attention to these wedge issues to polarize the American electorate. We might also think about suppressing political mobilization. In a lot of my work that I've done looking at the gender dimensions of foreign influence operations, there's a lot of identity-based disinformation that targets and has targeted feminism and women, promoting various women's rights movements online. And here we saw that it wasn't only about pitting, women against men, but it was also about demobilizing the activists by going after really critical points of collective identity and what it meant to be a feminist, and therefore then pushing narratives that feminism isn't for everybody. Feminism is too white to represent Black women, or it's too liberal to represent conservative women, or it's too wealthy to represent poor women, and really kind of tapping into and fracturing the collective identity needed to get mobilization off the ground. So we can also think about identity-based disinformation in this kind of democratic context where social movements are being suppressed or demobilized. We can also think about it in the context of political violence. You pointed to the example of Myanmar and the genocide against the Rohingya population there, but identity-based disinformation and genocide have a lot of connections because, genocide and political violence are inherently identity-based forms of violence. And so we can see connections there too. And so I think, overall, just by taking this broader approach and using identity as a framework, we can really start to see more broadly the challenges that identity-based disinformation can have for democracy and our democratic institutions.
I want to zoom in on a word you used, which is narrative. What is it about these sort of racist or sexist narratives or narratives about ideologies or social issues like feminism that makes it so hard for traditional solutions like debunking or media literacy to work well in this area? What is it about narrative that's so sticky compared to something that you could just sort of fact check away?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think one of the reasons why this is such an interesting but challenging problem to address is because there's both technical and human dimensions to the way that identity-based disinformation can spread. When I'm thinking about, some of the technical problems, algorithms might reinforce certain kinds of narratives to go viral. And the narratives that tend to go viral are things that resonate with human emotions, things that make us angry, things that make us scared, that make us afraid. And identity can be very wrapped up into how we perceive one another and the emotions that we feel. And so you have to kind of take this broader approach to address both the technical and the human. And I think, when we're thinking about narrative rather than individual kind of piece of disinformation, the stories that we tell over time about one another, it's not so easy to just put a label on something as being false. You can't just label racism. You can't just fact check a sexist claim the same way that you can kind of debunk individual pieces of disinformation. So I think that element too makes it very hard to combat.
You've said identity issues can be used to divide and demobilize, but they can also, we know, mobilize people around ideologies. And so I want to turn now to Raquel. Raquel, you've studied how the Brazilian far right mobilizes online. What can you tell us about the role of identity in that process?
The rise of this type of far right populism in Brazil is something very new and also new to Latin America, because we had before a lot of populist leaders, and populist leaders have a lot of connection to people. So we also have an identity connection here. People feel like they identify with this leader, but most of those leaders were left wing. So since the 2010s around, we have witnessed a surge in the far right radicalization and the emergence of populist far right leaders. So in Brazil, this was particularly through former President Jair Bolsonaro. He was elected into 2018, primarily through an online campaign, which was something unprecedented in the country. And through his campaign, he used a lot of language, a lot of discourses, and he woke up a lot of narratives that made people identify with him. So during his time in the office, he often employed a highly conservative discourse, especially regarding women and minority groups, alongside with the nihilism on issues such as the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and other subjects. So there was a lot of militarism, nationalism, and disinformation that were very central to his rhetoric. So a common theme was the us, the good people, Bolsonaro and his supporters, right? And the bad people, the others, the communists, everyone else who doesn't agree with us. So this constructed a lot of polarization in the country. He echoed very much among some more conservative communities, particularly the ones that were very unsatisfied with the liberal views, particularly on customs and society in general in the country. So he also used frequently a very religious discourse, very evangelical. There was, and here, evangelicalism and neo-Pentecostalism are some trends in religion that have grown a lot in Brazil in the last years. And Brazil is traditionally a Catholic country, so this is very different. And this religious base represents a significant portion of his support. And his far-right politics are strongly connected with these very conservative religious values, such as the role of women, the role of men, the traditional family. So through his presidency, Bolsonaro's discourse was amplified and legitimized via social media, mostly. And he was very successful in mobilizing thousands of people through identification. And these communities strongly supported him and his discourse because he was bringing back the good values, right? Those narratives, they persisted during his time in the office, and they resurfaced during the 2022 campaign. So he was candidate to re-election. And he frequently claimed that Brazilian institutions were corrupted, so they were not good, they were the bad people, and the election would be rigged, asserting that the only thing that could save the country was the military, right? The military. And, this made thousands of people camp in front of the country barracks, asking for the army to protect democracy. And by protect democracy, I mean cup, right? A cup de té. And after Bolsonaro lost in the end of October, his supporters organized protests. They were enraged, so they used social media. They organized protests. Those rage culminated in the attempted coup of January 8th. So this was a very strong connection to him and to his discourse. And this was very important to mobilize these people, to motivate them.
I want to ask you to say a little bit more about this element of polarization and the effect it has on democracy, the us versus them, good versus bad, black versus white, kind of Manichaean viewpoint that it encourages. What is it about that polarization, and how does identity play into it that contributes to democratic backsliding?
So I think that as we said in the beginning of this seminar, it's not all about true and falsehood. So there is, the country was so divided and so radicalized that people are drawing different conclusions from the same set of facts. They are using political discourse to find like-minded individuals. And the thing is, they cherry pick what connects to their already constructed views. And this type of content that is like cherry picked from the facts, this type of content is used to engage people in their communities, these online groups particularly. So because visibility is important to gather people, using sometimes even truthful information to create false impressions based on this identification is very common. It's very similar to supporting soccer teams. So people identify with one discourse over the other because there are certain symbols, certain words, and certain emotions that made them connect and feel that this discourse represents them, represents their views, and lead them to affiliate with the narrative. And the narrative is just not one thing. You have several other things connected. So if I affiliate with one part of the narrative, I will also start to be connected to the other parts. So once people are affiliated with these discursive communities, they tend to interpret everything, even non-political information, as part of the group's truth. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's something totally non-political at first, but you got some people refused. They refused to take any precautions at all, even if their lives were at risk, simply because their political communities asserted them that the pandemic is not real. So you don't need to take precautions. So identification legitimizes and resurface those hidden or previously taboos ideas, such as the notion that Brazil never experienced 30 years of a bloody military dictatorship, but rather a military government, right? So I changed the words, and I changed also the strength of the concept. And this government protected the good society from the degenerative customs. So this paves the way for a lot of other arguments like democracy is dead, military government is good, and it normalizes and popularizes radical ideas. So, for example, that the military can kill people because they want to save the good people, the good customers. So this dynamic contributed to this CUP in 2022. And I think it's very important to notice that these people, they really believe they are saving democracy, but they don't understand exactly what is this democracy that they are saving. It's like seeing things from their own perspective, right? So this allows the extremists to justify these measures and this behavior to themselves and to others.
Thanks, Raquel. I think that process of justification is really key, and you've hit on something really important there. I want us to think a little bit more about comparisons between countries, and for that reason, I want to turn now to you, Roberta, to ask how these trends are affecting Latino communities in the United States.
Great to be with everyone. Hi. So at DDIA, what we're doing is really using polling and narrative analysis, focus groups, and interviews to measure the impact of online harms on Latino communities, but also to track and monitor the cycle of information between the United States and Latin America, because we know that Latino communities are very much connected across the Americas, whether it's because we have ties to home, like in my case, I'm originally from Brazil, but I grew up in Wisconsin, and so, very connected to different information avenues, or because of identity questions like the ones that we're talking about. And so for Latino communities across our entire Western Hemisphere, information and misinformation and disinformation are very cyclical and borderless. I wanted to, Dean, kind of draw on two things that you mentioned earlier, both questions asked to Sam and then questions asked to Raquel, because I think they connect really well here. So the first thing you mentioned was why are narratives so difficult to contest? And something that we're seeing in Latino communities and Latino spaces in the US so narratives are really a story about the state of the world. They are a connection of dots. There's a beginning, middle, and end. Sometimes a connection between different stakeholders or a framing. And so the difficulty with narratives is that they're not entirely true or false. And I think Sam alluded to this earlier, right? An aspect of a narrative can be true, but maybe the framing of the narrative is improperly done or out of context, and it's being used to lead people to think one direction or another. The reason I bring this up is because we've done polling to measure the extent to which Latino communities are seeing and believing narratives and claims. And what we found was that narratives are penetrating at higher rates, and narratives that are more conspiracy than outright lies. For example, narratives that there is a deep state of political actors that's actively working to keep society down, and narrative about elites working with news media and social media companies to hide the truth from us. These aren't narratives that are specific to the US. They're very global, and they are narratives, I think, that also resonate across the Americas because of histories of corruption, histories of maybe governments not serving people the way that people expect. And these narratives of the people that were exposed to these or familiar with their existence, upwards of like 45% of Latinos of our 3,015 person sample agreed that they were true. And so I think that shows how concerning that is. And these communities, our Latino communities, we are being exposed and engaging with this information and disinformation, both in media ecosystems in the US, but also media ecosystems in Latin America. A lot of the folks that are spreading these narratives and claims are on YouTube or on WhatsApp, where communities spend a lot of time consuming news and information. And they are pundits, they're ideologues, they're influencers. And to Raquel's point, very much movements across countries are amplifying each other's ideologies and narratives to back up their own assertions and points of view. And so pivoting then to the second thing I wanted to say, the question you asked Raquel, and she brought up ideologies, she brought up election fraud and polarization. So the example of election fraud is a good one. We see election fraud narratives spreading in the context of this year's US elections a lot. We saw it in 2020. We saw it in Brazil in 2022. We're going to see it very soon picking up steam again. We're already seeing some of that. And election fraud narratives in Brazil were harnessing election fraud narratives in the US, and the only thing that was changing was the example they were using. So in the Brazil case, it's that electronic voting machines are rigged. In the US case, it's that ballot boxes are rigged, or that there are duplicates or errors in the day of are kind of leading to mass fraud. And then the second thing that I think is very cross-border and that we should be worried about, because it does tie to identity a lot, is what I'm going to say is the big lie 2.0, which is that non-citizens, quote unquote, are voting at such scale in the US context that they're trying to sway the elections. That is outright not true. We know that if it happens at such an ad hoc scale that it would never impact the outcome of an election. And that is very directly tied to the scapegoating of Latinos, but also migrants overall. And I think the identity piece kind of gets brought into that very much. And then the last point I just wanted to make was that we've found that identity and values are very connected to this, like Raquel mentioned, but more than we'd even expect. So we've done polling to determine, and we've been able to kind of build out subgroups and analyze who are the people that see and believe things the most. And we found that the people who see and believe the most are actually folks who say they have a lot of interest in politics. So politics is core to their values and identities. They are conspiratorial in nature already, so they're believing other conspiracy stories about the world. And they're choosing to consume news and information in very hyper-partisan spaces online. Again, that very connected to their values and identities. And so clearly, I think the concept of values and identities are what maybe correlates or leads people to maybe see and believe things more, not necessarily the amount of education someone has or the degree to which they have access to correct information. I think those are components of this problem, but I really love that you're focusing on identities because I do think our research shows that that's a huge correlating factor. So.
Thanks, Roberta. Your last point about this sort of framing of the problem as an information deficit, where people have wrong information or not enough information, and if you just give them the correct information, everything will fall into place. We've talked a lot about how identity problematizes that, but one point I've heard you make in the past, and I wonder if you might walk us through again here, is that it also sort of works on an assumption that, that people are especially gullible or susceptible or uneducated, and that just often is not the case and can be, especially when you're looking at vulnerable communities, quite condescending. So how should we think, what's a better way to think about the way these communities are impacted by mis and disinformation, and how we should factor that into our responses?
And so the better way to think about it is not necessarily in terms of susceptibility. Like, it's not in terms of quote unquote who falls for things. I think it's in terms of where we choose to engage, who our communities are, our lived experiences, and how diverse we are. So Latinos in the US are not monolithic at all. Framing the entire community as more vulnerable isn't the way to go. I would say we should think about studying subgroups more and then trying different solutions for different subgroups. And that's something that we've tried to do at DDIA. Our research has shown that actually every solution works. So fact-checking works, pre-bunking works, media literacy works. It's just going to work differently for different people depending on how far down the quote-unquote rabbit hole they are. And so someone who believes 1 in 15 false claims maybe needs a fact check, but a person that believes 14 out of 15 false claims needs something else, depolarization maybe. And so that's the way I would encourage us to think about it, is like, think about it more in terms of 1, the cycle of engagement, 2, the cycle of information consumption in communities, and 3, really digging into the nuance of different groups of people and trying to get at that instead of trying to think of this as like a demographics thing. Our research has found demographics are not a great predictor of whether someone engages with this information. So it's not someone's gender, it's not someone's age, it's not the state they live in, it's not countries of origin necessarily. It's behavior and psychology and identity. And so some of those things I mentioned, like where you're consuming information, who you're surrounding yourself with, how interested in politics you are. And so I really think that's how we shift, is away from, 1, painting communities as entirely monolithic, 2, away from thinking that people are victims of this problem, and 3, just more investment in nuance and culturally competent solutions and trying to understand how different people engage with different pieces of information.
I want to conclude by asking all of you the same 2 questions. First is that I want to note that policy discussions on these issues often revolve around social media, and we haven't talked much about technology or social media yet, but I want to bring that into the conversation. So what is the role of technology in the trends we've been discussing? And is our understanding of it too techno-determinist, or is it right to put technology at the center of this issue? And then the second question I want to ask all of you is, based on what we've heard today, how should policymakers, philanthropists, and other decision makers who allocate resources to strategies aimed at resolving these issues, how should they better account for the role of identity in disinformation? And Sam, since we started with you at the top, we'll start with you here.
when it comes to social media and technology being the focus of solutions, I certainly think they play a role, but they're not the only actors that we need to think about. For example, we might want to think about the way that we design for a more inclusive democracy by looking at the business models and incentives of certain kinds of narratives to go viral on algorithmically generated and produced platforms. That is one really big issue because I think companies need to do more and to do better to limit the algorithmic amplification of racism, of sexism, of xenophobia, of hate. There's a big role that companies can play there. And I think with the recent trends in cutting back in trust and safety measures, reducing the number of content moderators that can understand different and diverse communities. I think this is incredibly problematic and it moves us really in the wrong direction when we really need to dig into the nuances of identity and these information ecosystems that different kinds of users congregate and communicate in. And so I think there's certainly a big role for companies to do more and to do better. We don't want to leave them out of the solution. But, that's not the only problem here. And algorithms aren't the only problem too. We can think of the way that closed messaging systems, for example, create different kinds of affordances for the ways that identity-based mis and disinformation can spread. And that might have more to do with human elements, with networks of trust, with close familial ties, things that are very human that shape how we consume and integrate information into our identities and into our behaviors in the real world. And so we also need this human component to our solutions too, which are going to be very long term, and I think much more about building and rebuilding a lot of the empathy and understanding that I think social media has kind of helped strip away from our broader democratic societies over the years. And so coming up with strategies to rebuild that social capital, I think is going to be really, really important for also combating these harms. And so I think too, when it comes to what different philanthropic organizations can do to help advance solutions. One, investing in more research on different kinds of marginalized communities and groups, I think is going to be important, especially those that are advocating for better platform responses and thinking about solutions and driving innovative solutions in that space, I think is going to be a really big an important thing that these kinds of organizations can invest in. And I also think we need to think about this much more long term as well. It's not something that we can really solve overnight. Racism, sexism, hate, bias, discrimination, like these are long-standing issues that have been around for as long as humans have been around. And so we need to think of long-term investments in those kinds of social capital programming and spaces to really reduce this kind of societal level harm.
I totally agree with Samantha. So from my point of view and the data from my research, technology is certainly part of the problem. It's not all the problem, but it is certainly very connected to it, and particularly on how disinformation can generate and amplify violence, which was Samantha's point. So, for example, through social media platforms, people feel a lot more free to talk about several topics. They can find each other. This is very positive, but they can also feel free to be violent, to express things that they would never say in person to other people. And they can also find like-minded individuals that agree with what they are saying. and legitimize what they're saying. So, like Samantha said, people on social media, they are very connected, for example, to friends, to family. And we have seen that through those connections, they receive this information. And they receive this information from people they think are their friends, the group, the family group, for example, their friends groups, and they believe because, hey, my friend would never lie to me, so this has to be true. This has to be something that people are talking about. And social media has also increased the legitimation of this type of content. They normalize certain discourse. So, for example, I received a very radical, false, or misleading idea, misleading information, but it comes with thousands of likes, hundreds of views. So this tends to make it seem more real to me because other people are legitimizing it. Other people are saying it's true. So in Brazil and in Latin America, particularly because of the pandemic, people are using a lot more social media to connect with their friends and their families, so they're receiving more of this type of content. And there is another phenomenon, that is the fact that people are going to social media to find information and to find news. So they believe that what social media is publishing equals journalism, equals news. And this is also something that contributes to legitimize this disinformation, right? So this situation, of course, gets worse when algorithms show people content they are likely to agree or to engage with, which reinforce their views, and also filters out content they don't agree with. So I believe that social media platforms, they are not all the problem, but they are part of the problem. And we need to think about this. How do we make those platforms a more civilized place where people can receive credible information, where people can learn to identify what is true or what is good for them and what is false? And about the second question, so I totally agree, and I believe that identity plays a significant role in how people process and share information. So one thing that I think it's important is to reach for the individuals in this context, developing campaigns that resonate with their identity groups, that uses their language, speaks their language, recognize their values. So people tend to trust information that aligns with their cultural, political, or religious identity. So this is the same strategy that the far right uses to radicalize people. And I think it can be used to de-radicalize people as well. So like Roberta explained it previously, also understanding the dynamics and the values of these groups is very important. So we cannot combat disinformation from the outside. We need to do it from the inside with the people that are there. So we can craft messages that help, that are more likely to be understood by those peoples and are more likely to penetrate echo chambers, for example, to foster critical engagement. And research to understand this is key. We need to understand what these people, what those different cultural groups, what are their values, who they admire, who are their influencers. And this is another thing. It's crucial to engage with individuals that already have credibility within these groups, and people who are open enough to understand the risks and problems of radical discourses and disinformation. So religious leaders, community leaders, organizers, even influencers. So we can use people that already have trust in these groups to try and combat disinformation, to try and change this discourse. So these people's support and their messages can be much more effective in countering falsehoods than those from external sources. And I also think that's very important to take into account historical, regional, political context while promoting, for example, online media literacy. That is another thing that I believe can help people. So, for example, when I talked about how people think that sometimes social media is not just a lot of people talking, it's just news. So, in order to people understand the social media role and what is the information that circulates in these platforms, it's very important to educate them, right? To promote literacy. But to promote literacy, we also have to take into account these particularities of these groups. So those would be my 2 cents on this question, Dean.
Thanks, Raquel. I just want to note that this is at least the second time we've hit on trust and the need to work with trusted messengers and to communicate in trustworthy ways with these groups, rather than assuming that we have the facts and they should trust us, acknowledging that gap in trust is part of the obstacle that needs to be overcome. Roberta, what do you think on the role of tech here and how we should be positioning ourselves to respond to these problems given the role of identity?
Yeah, thank you, Dean. So, I mean, I think we need to segment out tech. So I'll just focus on social media companies for now. But social media, I think like this was alluded to by Raquel and by Sam. But social media, at the end of the day, has completely fundamentally changed our entire news and information ecosystem. And so I think it's important to recognize that, sure, like maybe social media didn't create online harms, but it is certainly amplifying online harms, and it has fundamentally changed the space in which those online harms exist. And so something that I think is really important to do is we do need to, I think Sam alluded to the center tech in the solutions problem, but also go beyond that. I think I agree that tech solutions to tech problems isn't the right framework here. And like at DDIA, we're very much focused on the human-centered approach, understanding the psychological, social media drivers of engagement with online harms. But I think at the end of the day, we will never have the same power as a giant corporation with millions and billions of dollars. And so I think we do need to recognize that business models need to change, that platforms do need to be held accountable for their actions, that we do need laws and regulations to be updated for the modern world. And we simply can't keep going the way that we are, because one decision made in a thoughtless way or one decision made quickly here and there actually has a disproportionate impact on society writ large. It's not one for one in this way. And so I do think that placing tech at the center of this is important to do, and not just having conversations with tech, but also pushing tech to do better. And I think that to our experiences with Latino communities, this is anecdotal, of course, because we can't see the entirety of the internet. But we do know that social media companies are doing an asymmetric job of implementing terms of service in different platforms in non-English languages. And we do know that they don't always have the same tools and skilled like employees to understand those nuances that are cultural. And I think at the end of the day, there's this default to doing more in English than in other languages. And I think that really does and has, and we've seen how an impact on harms in different communities in different countries. And then to your second question, Dean, about what can funders be doing? What can people who support our work be doing? Raquel said this perfectly, and I think that this is important, but it is, I think, investing in empowering and giving a platform to people from different backgrounds to do this type of work. And not just from an advocacy perspective. I think, for example, in our case, we're really trying to have Latinos represented in places where decisions are being made. And we know historically, governance has happened in traditionally white spaces and older spaces in Europe and North America. And I think our countries and our regions have a lot to offer. Brazil is very innovative, for example. Our civil society is blossoming. It's incredibly powerful. There's a lot of interesting work being done. And I don't think that we always take that into consideration. Oftentimes, the way that Europe and North America talk about other regions in the world, and I'll just say the global South, for example, I don't like that term very much, is a little bit like a parent to child dichotomy. And I don't think that that's the right way to go about it. And just like we talked about, foreign other attacking us and making us victims is also not the right way to think about it. So we really, I think, need to be thinking and investing in ecosystem-wide innovation and recognizing that the future of our engagement with online harms and information writ large is different. And so for us at DDIA, for example, next year, we're really hoping to do more with new newsmakers, right? Raquel brought up influencers. I think, like it or not, we've shifted as a society kind of away from traditional news toward oversaturation of other content creators in spaces where we're spending time. And so we have to engage with those people more. A lot of them that I know have the sense of responsibility to produce fact-based content. They might not have the training, they may not have the resources, they may not have the connections. And so I think also like funders should think about that and how we can make sure that the people who have an oversized impact in producing the information and who might have the trust that Raquel alluded to are also then being funded and equipped to do the best job that they possibly can to produce good information with our organizations engaging with them.
I want to thank you, our audience, for listening to this webinar. I hope it's helped you think more about the role of media and information technology in the many trends threatening democracy around the world today. I especially hope that it's given you some ideas for how to respond, because these are tricky challenges which leaders, activists, funders, scholars, and many societies are all grappling with simultaneously. Maybe most importantly, I want to thank our panelists, Sam, Raquel, Roberta, for joining us. And I want to thank Paloma and the Kettering Foundation for giving us the opportunity to come together and speak today.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to Dean and to Paloma, Raquel, and Roberta for the wonderful panel discussion today. It's been such a pleasure, and I'm glad we're able to bring more attention to these issues of identity-based disinformation in democracy.
So thank you all. It was a pleasure to be here discussing this, which I consider very important issues. Thanks, Paloma. Thanks, Dean, for leading this. Thanks, Roberta. Thanks, Sam, for being part of this discussion with me. And I hope the audience also got some important information from our discussion.
Thank you, everyone. It was really a pleasure to be here, and a huge thank you to the Kettering Foundation for opening up this space. I do think that multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary approaches to these are the way to go, and so I'm really glad that we got a chance to share ideas and lessons learned in the space. And definitely feel free to reach out to us or anything you might need. Pleasure to be here, and thank you all so much for the time.
Thank you so much, Dean. Thank you, Samantha, Raquel, and Roberta, for your important insights and helping us understand this troubling phenomenon and how it's impacting our societies and democracies and what we can do about it. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Kettering President and CEO, Sharon L. Davies, who will offer some reflections.
I'm Sharon Davies. I'm the president and CEO of the Charles F. Kettering Foundation, and I hope that you have enjoyed this webinar today, which has focused on the eroding commitments to democracy around the world, sometimes referred to as democratic backsliding. What we learned from experts like those in this webinar is that this is a global phenomenon. And it is due in part to the rise of a new generation of authoritarian leaders. Authoritarian leaders are always bent on eroding commitments to democratic systems, and always because of their motivation to consolidate their own power and to insulate themselves from democratic structures of accountability. This is always also at the expense of the broader public, the democratic public. Authoritarian leaders do this through a variety of methods, and the method that we focused on in this particular webinar is the tactics of using social media and other outlets, purposefully to spread misinformation or disinformation that is designed to stoke division among the populace, often by reinforcing existing social divides. The goal is to cement an us versus them mentality in society, and as a result, to polarize the public. In diverse societies, authoritarian leaders do this by driving wedges between social groups or maybe exaggerating wedges between social groups, amplifying grievances that already exist or creating grievances that don't yet exist. And very often, unfortunately, this is done to minorities in democratic publics along the lines of race or ethnicity or religion or gender identity or sexual orientation or nationality. The tactic that is used by these authoritarian type leaders is to propagate falsehoods and even sometimes to invent grievances out of thin air. We heard about some of those in this particular webinar. A recent example of this in the United States is the falsehoods that are currently being spread about Haitian immigrants in the small city of Springfield, Ohio. Outright lies about their status as illegal aliens when in truth they are there legally. Outright disinformation about their conduct, such as the claims that they are stealing, killing, and eating their neighbors' pets. The aim is actually not, as we learned in this webinar, to make people really believe those outlandish lies as it is to other people, and to keep them in different groups, to make them the objects of suspicion and repulsion and maybe even hatred. Once that is done, authoritarians are long along the way of consolidating their power and feeling as though they can act in non-democratic ways towards those disparaged groups with far less accountability. I hope that you have taken some important information from this webinar. The Charles F. Kettering Foundation stands ready to continue to provide information like this to a democratic society so that all of us can remain alert to these kinds of threats to democracy and utilize our power as members of democratic societies to fight these threats. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon. And thank you for bringing some current examples that are very close to home, especially for those of us here in Ohio. And thank you again to Dean, Roberta, Raquel, and Samantha for your critical insights into how to recognize and counter these disinformation tactics and why it's so important that we do. Thanks so much.